Okay, so what actually is a MIDI keyboard? So a MIDI keyboard is a type of MIDI controller. So first, what is MIDI? MIDI is a language, it's like a coding language, it's a protocol that is used with our music programs. So for example, if you were to press a note here, it is going to trigger the note in your music program where we are then playing our virtual instruments or various sounds within the computer. So the MIDI keyboard does not have sounds in it. We are plugging it in through USB. Okay, so in the back of these MIDI keyboards, it's a USB type B connection. Okay, again, this is a printer cable. And then obviously you probably know this for USB. This is type A connection, USB type A and then USB type B. So we plug in our MIDI keyboard to our computer with a USB cable, which gives us that MIDI connection. And essentially, your MIDI keyboard is kind of like the control hub of your studio. Think of it as, if you're in a spaceship and the pilot is hitting all his commands, all the buttons in front of him. That's essentially what a MIDI keyboard does. And if your MIDI keyboard does not work good with your music program, you're not going to get that really good experience. For example, a lot of MIDI keyboards in music programs, sometimes these transport buttons don't work good. Or sometimes you want to map the mod wheel and the pitch wheel, or sometimes those don't work good. So rule number one is understand what you need a MIDI keyboard for. Okay. I personally, I'll just tell you what I like in a MIDI keyboard, and that might give you some direction. I like a 49 key MIDI keyboard. I like the keys to be semi-weighted. I have to make sure that my transport buttons have the play, stop, record, forward a bar, back a bar, as well as the loop button. So that is 6 transport buttons. These are what we use to control our music programs, play and stop. Okay, it's what we call the transport buttons. If your MIDI keyboard comes with knobs and sliders, it's nice to have. I would miss them if I don't have them, but it's not a necessity. Okay, but it does give a much better experience. And the drum pads, these are the exact same thing as the keys. So when I talk to you about MIDI, for example, if we hit this right here, let's just say it plays a C5 in your music program. You hit this, C5. You could set this up to be C5 as well. So what's the difference? It's just the feel. So a lot of times beat makers like the rubber pads because when you hit it with your fingers, it kind of bounces back. It feels a little better on the fingers. But if you are understanding what I'm telling you, if this MIDI note and this MIDI note are the exact same thing, then you actually have 49 paths, 49 slices, 49 keys. So if you like to do sampling, you can slice with 49 slices. And then here you have an octave button, so you can go up and down the octaves. So you have full range of your keys. But the benefit of a 49 key is that it is smaller, it's more affordable, and it gives a phenomenal experience as a beat maker. For myself, to the right, I always like to put my MIDI key or my audio interface either to the left or to the right of the MIDI keyboard. And what that allows you to do is when you're making your beats, let's just say you hit record, you hit play, it counts you in, so it'd go, and then all of a sudden you play, whatever keys you want to hit, then you hit stop. So now you've recorded those notes. You want to hit play again. Let's just say the music's a little loud. You can turn down your volume right to the right. Okay, so it's all about workflow. So what I want to talk to you about in this video was, again, what is a MIDI keyboard? A MIDI keyboard is just a type of MIDI controller that we plug into our computer that controls our music program as well as allows us to play our notes. Now, when it comes to the different brands and stuff out there, for myself, I like a 49 key semi-weighted. This is very hard to find. Usually semi-weighted keys start in the 61 key model, but again, they're more expensive as well as they're much bigger. And a typical desk is not very big to begin with for, in the studio. So that's pretty much it, guys. A MIDI keyboard is a type of MIDI controller that we just plug into our computer. If you're getting a $100 one or if you're getting a $1,000 one, you're honestly getting the same experience in terms of playing your virtual instruments and your sounds and stuff. So what is the difference? So the difference between a low quality one is maybe the actual plastic is cheaper. Like for example, if I were to push down on the keys, maybe the cheaper MIDI keyboard would kind of squeak and stuff. It would just be build quality is cheap. On a cheaper one, you might not get the sliders. You might get knobs, but you might not get sliders. Or you might get sliders, but not knobs. Or you might not get drum pads. But if you're understanding what I'm telling you, drum pads are the same thing as keys. So you have to understand that if you don't need the drum pads, the keys are the same thing. It's just a different feeling. That's all it is. So when these more advanced MIDI keyboards introduce these features like auto chord mode or auto scale mode, you are paying for the time and research of those, these companies that they put into the MIDI keyboard. So for me, I would rather them not take the time to do that stuff. Give me a better quality MIDI keyboard, better keys, give me really, honestly, nowadays, I would like to see a motorized fader on the MIDI keyboard, which would be amazing because you could just switch through different banks and these would just kind of all switch for you and you get a really, really cool mixing experience. On the higher end MIDI keyboards, you might see like metal knobs instead of plastic knobs. But honestly, like how much is a knob? So let's just say this plastic knob is, let's say like $1. Okay, so each one of these, let's say it costs them $1 for each knob. Now we go to the metal ones. Okay, so let's say the metal ones are $5 each, right? It's like, but does that really justify a $100 MIDI keyboard to a $1,000 MIDI keyboard just by giving you metal knobs? So just understand that a very expensive MIDI keyboard does not give you like a better experience when it comes to playing your melodies and stuff. Yes, the keys might be better on those higher end MIDI keyboards because that usually comes in, right? So we call this a key bed. When we were playing our keys, it's like the key bed. It's like the quality of when we're pushing down. And so, for example, the quality of this key bed is really good. Like it feels like when you're pushing it, has a little bit of spring back. Like there's a bit of pressure there, which is nice. It feels good. This keyboard right here is the one I personally use. So this was my my very first MIDI keyboard, and it was awesome. But what was happening was the octave button was starting to fail. I opened up the MIDI keyboard. I tried to fix it. It was working for a bit, started to fail again. So I got a new MIDI keyboard. I've been using this one for probably like maybe 3 or 4 years now. It's been awesome. But the keys are a little cheap feeling. Like even though they're semi-weighted, they're not like the Axiom. So this is the M Audio Axiom 49 second generation. It's discontinued. It was an awesome MIDI keyboard when I used it. The keys here, they are semi-weighted. They do feel better than really, really cheap piano keys, but they're not like this Axiom. Okay. So understand that a MIDI keyboard is always going to give you not as good as an experience as a real piano. So for myself, if I'm playing the piano, as a beat maker, I like to practice on a real piano. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, a real piano is going to give you the amazing piano key feel. Okay. The second thing is latency. You're going to get like no latency on a real piano because you can't get more, you really can't get faster than a real piano. The hammer hits the string, you can hear it right away. When we are playing a MIDI keyboard, we have what's called latency. And the more powerful your computer, the less latency you're going to have. But these are all just things to think about. So understand that if you're going to purchase a MIDI keyboard to practice the piano, you're going to get a subpar experience. Like you're not going to get the best experience for practicing. This is really meant for controlling our music program with its transport buttons. Okay, so again, the transport buttons are the stop, play, record, loop, forward a bar, backwards, back a bar. You got your keys. You have your sliders and knobs if you want that kind of stuff. For the most part, honestly, using a mouse, an actual mouse. So you have your typing keyboard, you have a mouse, and then you have your MIDI keyboard. A mouse is honestly going to be your fastest way most of the time when you're using your music program. But in some areas, you can set up your MIDI keyboard to give you a bit more hands-on experience. But when you look in the real professional studios and you see them always working with their hands, most of the time as beat makers, you really don't get that hands-on experience. You really have to think about your workflow. You have to learn how you can customize your MIDI keyboard within your DAW to set it up. There's a lot of time, a lot of planning, a lot of thinking, and figuring out how it works in your music program. So just understand that just because a MIDI keyboard has a feature. So for example, this MIDI keyboard, when I was new, I purchased it. It had a feature called Direct Link. And I was like, oh, cool, because it would automatically map the sliders and knobs in your music program to certain virtual instruments and plugins. But in my personal DAW that I use FL Studio, this feature was not supported. So it was like, oh, well, I don't get that experience that this, it comes with the MIDI keyboard, but my music program doesn't support it. But the power of FL Studio is you can customize your MIDI keyboard however you want. It just takes a little bit more time, but once you learn that workflow, you get a phenomenal experience of literally setting up your MIDI keyboard however you want. And now with MIDI scripting, again, that requires coding knowledge of the Python coding scripting language there. But I hope this helps you, okay? Understand that if you're watching a review, what you should be watching the review for is just understanding about build quality, or if the company did something weird with their product. One thing I will say here is this MIDI keyboard is a great MIDI keyboard. I'll just put it right here. And so this is the Native Instruments Complete A49. It's priced very, very affordably. So very, very good price. 49 key, semi-weighted. Like I said, very, very hard to find. The key bed feels very, very good. But there's a problem with this MIDI keyboard. Number one, it requires a lot of software to run. Okay, so sometimes when you use a MIDI keyboard, most of the time you plug it in with a USB cable. You simply install a driver, and you're good to go. But this keyboard, the Complete Control A49, it requires a lot of their software in order to use all the features of the MIDI keyboard. If you plug in just with a USB cable, you can still use it. You still can use most of the transport buttons, and you can also use the knobs without their software, but you're not able to use a lot of the other buttons. One last thing I just want to say is with Native Instruments, when you use their products, you kind of get locked in a little bit to their ecosystem. So they have tons and tons of products, and they're very, very high quality. And those who use Native Instruments products do get a good experience. But just understand that if you go this route to purchase this type of MIDI keyboard from this company, you are starting to kind of enter their ecosystem of controllers using their products. And so I personally just didn't like all the software that was required to run Native Instruments on my computer. I just found there was like so much software, and I didn't like that experience. Okay, so for myself at the moment of making this video, I use the M Audio Oxygen Pro. I find for the price, it's a very fair price, very jam-packed in terms of the sliders, the knobs, the tons of drum pads, you get the different banks. The actual piano key quality is okay. Comparing to this keyboard as well as the A49 does feel a little bit better on the keys, and it's more affordable. But like I said here, just in terms of it not being so heavy with software, being pretty fairly priced, 49 key, semi-weighted, fully jam-packed, this is the one I'm currently using, and it's given me a very good experience. And before we go, let me just share the back of a MIDI keyboard, because every MIDI keyboard is a little bit different. So this one in particular, you can see that we have a power switch. So for myself, I always like when my equipment has an on and off switch. You'll notice that a lot of equipment doesn't, and when you have it, you really do appreciate it. This MIDI keyboard has plug-in power, but most MIDI keyboards are just powered through USB. So USB gives the MIDI keyboard its power as well as the MIDI signal. This type of connection right here is the old school MIDI connection. Okay, nowadays we just use USB. So don't get confused. You just use a USB cable for power and MIDI. If you were using old school sound modules and stuff like that, then you might want to use these MIDI cables, okay? And then this is how you can plug in a pedal. And I will do a separate video about, do you need a pedal for your MIDI keyboard? I sometimes like to use one just for when I'm practicing melodies and stuff, because it makes the notes a little bit longer when you're practicing, but you don't want to record with that pedal because it's a nightmare to edit your MIDI notes. Okay, so there you go. That is our video about what is a MIDI keyboard. Remember, a MIDI keyboard is a type of MIDI controller that we are using to control our music program. It's very important that you have a MIDI keyboard that works good with your specific music program. And again, I always talk to you about, I use FL Studio. If you don't have a good MIDI keyboard for a good workflow, it really ruins your experience as a beat maker, because again, just think of yourself as like a pilot in the cockpit, and essentially this is how we control our music program. We want to be able to, hit stop and it works. We want to be able to hit play and it works. And you might think, oh, well, that's pretty simple. But even today, it's not as straightforward as what you think. Sometimes these hardware controllers, these MIDI controllers, sometimes they just don't work in your music program the way that you think it should work. So there you go. A MIDI keyboard is a MIDI controller. There's no sounds in it, so don't get tricked from a cheap one to an expensive one. I think this is a sweet spot around that $350 price. Honestly, even at that $350 price, I would really like to see motorized faders. If any company is watching this video, my dream MIDI keyboard would be motorized faders, endless encoders. So I'll quickly talk about that before moving on. So on a MIDI keyboard, when it comes to knobs, there's a couple different knob types that are out there. There is what we call an endless encoder, and you can see I can just continually rotate this. Okay, an endless encoder is really awesome because there's really no beginning and end point. Whereas an absolute encoder, so it has a fixed end and a fixed beginning. Now, at times this is powerful, but if you switch between banks, it's kind of annoying to work with. In this case, if we switch a bank, you can just instantly start off where it is and you're good to go. Okay, but the absolute encoder does work, and when you switch a bank, there's something called soft takeover, so it won't just automatically switch your parameter. You actually have to rotate it, and you'll see it on the screen. It will have a little bar, and then once it kicks in, then you're good to go. But it just gives a little bit of a slower workflow. So the dream MIDI keyboard would be a 49 key, semi-weighted, with quality keys, like give us nice, good keys to enjoy. Motorized faders so that when we switch between banks, they can rotate. Behringer one time attempted this. It doesn't look like you can purchase it anymore. And then endless encoders so that when we switch banks, we can start off exactly where we were and we get an amazing hands-on experience. I don't really care about the drum pads, but if you have checked out my Oxygen Pro Premium template, you'll see with MIDI scripting, I have set up the drum pads for a really, really cool workflow to change presets, to open windows, and to kind of navigate FL Studio. So if we open plugins, we can rotate through those plugins, we can close plugins. It just gives a really, really cool experience. And then if you set up global links in FL Studio, which means that when you open a plugin, you can map your knobs and sliders to be remembered. So for example, let's say open a compressor. For example, I can just hit a button, opens the compressor. I can get hands-on mixing right here, just like this. And then I can hit a button, I can close it. I could go between like mixer tracks, open another plugin. We can like rotate through those plugins. So that would give me the absolute best experience, because then my MIDI keyboard could be my MIDI keyboard, which is a controller to play my instruments. I could have all the transport buttons, and it could also be the mixing controller as well at the same time for a phenomenal experience. Otherwise, if you want to purchase like a motorized fader, they're expensive, but I would really say if one company were to create that, they create a high quality MIDI keyboard, motorized faders, endless encoders, nice MIDI keys, and all 6 transport buttons: play, stop, record, back a bar, forward a bar, and the loop button. If you were to create a high quality product like that, I'm sure that would sell very, very well. And just like most other motorized fader controllers, just follow the MCU, the Mackie Control Universal Protocol there. All right, so there is my video about what is a MIDI keyboard. I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, for me, the biggest thing is 49 keys, semi-weighted. And again, just make sure when you're watching those tutorials or reviews that does it work good for your DAW? Because just because they say in the video or whatever, you really have to make sure it works good for your personal workflow. Okay. So closing out here, guys, if you guys want to learn FL Studio, I have tons of FL Studio books. Again, if you want to learn to make drum loops, check out Safe Spots. It's a really cool training. I spent a lot of time designing this concept of how to program powerful drum loops. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave comments below or just visit me at itsGratuiTous.com. And again, this video was kind of a part of our studio assembly series where I was just reassembling my studio. If you guys have any questions, you feel free to send me an email at hi@itsGratuiTous.com or just visit the website, itsGratuiTous.com. Hope you guys find yourself a really good MIDI keyboard. Again, this M Audio Oxygen Pro 49 is the one that I'm currently using at the moment. There's a free MIDI script, which gets the transport buttons working good, as well as a premium add-on to have a really cool workflow off of the drum pads. I'll leave the link in the description. So again, I teach you guys how to make beats with a MIDI keyboard with one-shot drum samples, and we make our powerful beats, right? Hip-hop kind of beats, rap kind of beats, dance kind of beats. I'll see you over at itsGratuiTous.com if you are interested in some premium beat-making training. If If you guys would like to learn FL Studio, check out my free book called 5 Keys to a Successful Beat. So simple it becomes creative. Get it by going to itsGratuiTous.com/5 keys.